There's also recent work. I've taken an experiment by Hassan, Simmons, and Todorov, 2005, which is intended to undermine the results of Gilbert's experiments and show that those experiments don't really show that acceptance is by default. And what this evidence seems to show is that pragmatic factors play a role in Gilbert's experiments. His results are not true across the board. And the alternative that Hassan and Simmons, the alternative hypothesis they made was this: false statements may be easier to represent and remember, and less likely, therefore, to be misrecalled as true when it's relevant to know that they're false. The thing about the Hopi examples was the participants didn't care whether the words were true or false. They weren't students of language. They were just doing a pure memorization task. So the idea was, well, suppose we produce false utterances, some of which are highly relevant and some of which aren't relevant. Maybe we'll get a difference in the results of Gilbert's tests. And the sort of examples they used were given in 4A, 4B, 5A, and 5B. If you look at the 4A, this person has a television. Well, most people have televisions, so it's irrelevant to know it's true. But actually, if you're told it's false that this person has a television, that's quite relevant, because you can infer, well, this is someone slightly strange, maybe bookish, maybe academic. And it's known that inferences about people, when you're shown someone's face, you draw inferences automatically. And so in that case, the false one is actually relevant. But if you compare that with 5A and 5B, this person walks barefoot to work. Well, here, if true, that would be relevant, because it's a weird thing to do to walk barefoot to work. On the other hand, 5B, this person walks barefoot to work. If you're told it's false, who cares? Of course, that's expected. So the prediction was that there would be a difference in the reactions to 4B, the relevant utterance, which was false, and 5B, the irrelevant utterance, which was false. And this is exactly what they found. People remembered that 4B was false even when they were distracted during processing the indication that it was false, but they performed as Gilbert had predicted on 5B. So the idea is you're automatically drawing inferences about people, and those inferences make a difference. Relevance makes a difference to whether you remember a false statement or not. So pragmatics is affecting the results of Gilbert's experiments. You don't default accept something that's actually relevant to you. When something isn't relevant to you, who cares? You heard someone assert it, well, maybe it's true, but when it matters, you assess it. So on the basis of that sort of result, Sperber et al., 2010, made a proposal about the relation between understanding and believing, which is actually different from all the proposals in the literature so far. The default people say understanding and believing are identical processes. People like Hassan, Simmons, and Todorov say, first you understand, or Grice and Strawson say, first you understand, and then you believe. And what Sperber et al. Are saying is, comprehension and acceptance may involve two distinct processes, but which work in parallel or in competition. They may both be working simultaneously. One is geared to identifying the relevance of what's communicated on the assumption that it's trustworthy, and the other is geared to assessing its trustworthiness. That's a much weaker position than the default acceptance position. So over to page 3 then, the big question is, well, suppose that's right, how is trustworthiness assessed? And do we have any evidence that trustworthiness assessment, epistemic vigilance is going on? So the hypothesis that we're pursuing is that there are two types of epistemic vigilance process, one of which has been much better studied than the other. 6A, you're assessing the reliability of the speaker while they're speaking. So that's one factor. But also, you're assessing the believability of the content, irrespective of the reliability of the speaker. So the hypothesis is there are two factors involved: vigilance towards what's called the source of information, the speaker, or vigilance towards the content, whether the content is intrinsically believable. And there's been a lot of work done in the last 5 years or so, mainly by Paul Harris and his associates, on monitoring the reliability of speakers, particularly in children. So if you remember the Burge quotation that I gave on the first page, he looked as if he was making an empirical claim. He said, as children and often as adults, we lack reasons not to accept what we are told. So that's a very easy thing to start assessing. And so people have been trying to answer the question, are children gullible? Do they really start out life by believing everything they're told? That claim was presumably made by people who didn't have children. Seems to be the opposite, but in any case, apart from anecdotal evidence, there is some actual, experimental evidence. So Koenig and Harris, there are several surveys, and I've taken evidence from one of these surveys by Koenig and Harris. So infants at 16 months, that's really very young, but they were old enough to have some words in their vocabulary. So at 16 months, they were shown pictures of familiar objects whose names they already knew, and they heard accurate or inaccurate labels of those objects from 3 different sources. First, a human looking at the picture. Second, a human with his back to the picture. And third, an audio speaker. And the idea is this, if it makes a difference to the children, whether the speaker was looking at the object or looking away from the object or wasn't even human, if it makes a difference, if the children register that, they're not just blindly accepting, they're monitoring the speaker. And indeed, the results showed that children tended to be surprised when a human looking at the picture in A gave a false label. They tended to be surprised when a human looking away from the object gave a true label. And they tended not to be surprised either way by the audio speaker. So they are really monitoring the perceptual access of the speaker at 16 months. That's really very early. At 24 months, so a lot of experiments of this type have been done. At 24 months, children heard speakers produce accurate or inaccurate labels for several familiar objects whose names they knew, and then label a novel object whose name the child didn't know, but using standard cues for word learning like eye gaze, pointing, showing, and so on. And the question was, would the children take account of the past reliability of speakers, the past accuracy or inaccuracy? And the answer is they did. They tend to learn the words only from previously accurate speakers, so they selectively mistrust inaccurate speakers. And they're getting very subtle in now in the experiments they can do. 3-year-olds then can take account of a very wide range of factors, including whether the speaker is well-disposed or ill-disposed. A nice speaker you're going to trust more than a nasty speaker. And actually that's still true in adults probably. Speaker's attitude, indications of certainty or hesitation, often using sort of epistemic modals, grammaticalized evidentials, things like that. At 3, children can master those. Past accuracy records, and things like epistemic access. For example, if a speaker says this is blue while looking at an object, they'll believe her. But if the speaker says it is blue while touching an object inside, under a cover, they won't trust her. And then from 4 to 6, they become increasingly able to cope with intentional deception. The fact that the speaker isn't just mistaken, but is intending to deceive them. That's a very difficult thing, and they're doing it from about the age of 4 to 6. So the conclusion is then that children appear predisposed to monitor the reliability of individual speakers and to allocate trust selectively, which they do with increasing sophistication. So, of course, these are empirical results, and the philosophers could respond by saying, well, I'm telling you what people should do, not what they do. But there is a general line of argument that says, if through evolution these epistemic vigilance processes have developed, it's because they're needed. And therefore, the norm should be not that you accept by default. You just place yourself, you make yourself incredibly vulnerable to deceit, to the free rider problem, if you like, in evolutionary psychology. Now, there's much less work being done on how adults monitor the reliability of speakers, but presumably these same factors become increasingly more sophisticated. There is one nice social psychology experiment that shows that adult speakers are very, very fast to judge the trustworthiness of others from pictures of faces. So participants were shown pictures of faces, and they were asked to judge them on 5 different criteria, not all at once, different people. Attractiveness, trustworthiness, competence, likability, and aggressiveness. First after 100 milliseconds, that's very, very fast indeed, and then with no time limit. They could take as long as they like. And the results of the very fast judgment and the no time limit judgment were then compared. And the idea would be, if you change your mind, given lots of time, then your initial judgment was probably not very trustworthy. On the other hand, if your initial judgment very fast agreed with the one after with no time limit, then your initial judgment was probably likely to be more accurate. And what they found was that trustworthiness was the highest correlation between initial judgments and later judgments was for trustworthiness, actually even more than attractiveness, which you'd think that you could read off a face immediately. People were better at judging trustworthiness, or at least didn't change their minds about trustworthiness as much as they did about attractiveness when given more time. So what this suggests is that the general trustworthiness of others is again automatically assessed. You've got an automatic process for assessing trustworthiness, which works very fast and which could obviously feed the source monitoring process. So the hypothesis then is that increasingly fine-grained vigilance processes may enable adults to track past accuracy and other things, not only for individual speakers, but also, if you think about it, for speakers on particular topics. We all know that someone's reliable on one topic, but not on another topic, or in different circumstances, when drunk versus when sober, or when he has an interest in the result versus when he doesn't. So what's needed now is much more fine-grained work on how adults are monitoring the reliability of speakers, but it seems unquestionable that they are. And if you think about it, there are probably implications for cross-cultural variation here. You know, there are these standard anecdotes about how direction giving in different cultures. In some cultures, if you ask someone for directions, he feels he's going to lose face if he doesn't know, so he'll answer, who cares? He'll just give you an answer. Now, presumably in those cultures, people are much less trusting when people give them directions than in other cultures, and you know, that sort of thing. So past reliability then is bound to affect one's judgments of reliability, and that's a clear factor that could vary cross-culturally. So the question is then, is the trustworthiness of the speaker the only factor governing the move from understanding to believing? Now, I'm going to skip this next little bit on Grice. It was a sort of neat little way of showing that actually the Grice-Strawson famous definition of meaning, which is the Sperber-Wilson definition of meaning plus an extra clause, and lots of Griceans insist that extra clause is needed. I was actually going to go through a little counterexample that Grice produced to his own definition, based on precisely cases where the content is believable independently of the source. I won't have time to go into that, so I'll skip directly to the end of that section.